Welcome back, everyone, to XP Game Developers Online. Our next talk is going to be Marshall, who's going to be joining us, the Chief Marketing Officer at MegaCat Studios, with his talk, The New Life for Old Pixels, How Innovation in Retro Gaming is Creating New Opportunities. So Marshall is a career marketer and the author of more than 15 books. With his work spanning journalism, video games, and a variety of client industries, he brings a nuanced perspective formed from years of working with innovative creators. Thanks for joining us today, Marshall.
I'm happy to be here. I appreciate you having me.
All right. So we are starting a few minutes behind, so I'm not going to hold up the presentation any longer. Marshall, mic is yours. And also, if you have any questions, please feel free to just drop them in the chat, and we will pass them over to Marshall.
Excellent. So I think we can fit this talk in the next hour to make sure our next presentation gets started on time.
Oh, no worries.
But we have a lot to cover, and I get pretty enthusiastic and pretty geeky about this. So what we're going to talk about today is the influence that retro gaming is having on the gaming industry of the present and the innovation that we're seeing there from a variety of angles. So you're probably at least tangentially aware of retro games and what that community might look like, but it tends to be a lot deeper than you'd realize, and there's a lot more implications there than even a lot of people that work within the industry on a day-to-day basis see if they're not specifically working in retro or working with retro type products. So there's a lot of angles to cover here, and this is something that's very deeply a part of our DNA as a company. So this is a medium that we work with on a daily basis. So one of the weird things about MegaCat is that we still make retro games. We make new games that are playable on old hardware. So think like a new NES cartridge, cartridge and everything's got the board in it, plugs into a console, and will play like a cartridge of that era. But it's brand new content. It's a brand new gameplay experience. And when we first started kind of hanging our shingles out at conventions and at various gaming events, setting up CRT screens and the whole bit, people would come up to our booth and they would be equally perplexed and equally enthusiastic. They would hold up a cartridge and they would say, "Are these real? Do they work? Why are you doing this?" Because they couldn't imagine it would ever be a sustainable business. And several years later, we're still having a lot of those conversations, sometimes with people that are pretty deep in the industry. So we've started to put together education around what this retro community looks like and what the full implications are, because it's a lot bigger than a few hobbyist creators. It's a lot bigger than a few fans that are still making retro games. There's a whole industry here, and it's driving some pretty big forces behind the scenes as well that I think are going to be important in the future. So to just add on here, we also make modern games. It's really our main focus these days is modern games, but the retro is kind of like 30-40% of our business, and then modern tie-ins, we'll talk about how that works. So we're a full-fledged game studio in that respect. Jason gave me a very kind intro, so I'll just throw in here, I'm a Super Nintendo fan over Sega Genesis. That's mostly an inside joke. Sometimes our team gets kind of fractured between Super Nintendo versus Sega, and it's become an interesting cultural battle within the MegaCat studio. So just throwing that out there in case there's fellow Super Nintendo fans in the audience. So let's talk about the retro renaissance. So there's a lot of layers to unpack here, but I wanted to frame it to make sure that everyone watching understands what we're talking about here. So we're talking about new retro content. So we're talking about content that can play on original hardware. So it works on a cartridge, works under the hardware constraints of an NES, of an SNES, of a Sega Genesis. We've also done projects for other consoles that are a little less popular in terms of current product purchases, but it's there's still a lot of creativity to be had here. So we have pictured here a couple MegaCat projects, creepy brawlers in the bottom right, think like Punch-Out, except you're fighting horror monsters. So it has those kind of classic retro mechanics. So the digital content that's loaded on the cartridge is part of the story here. The other part of the story that we need to talk about is the physical experience itself. So there's kind of this duality of what makes retro engaging. It's not only the type of gameplay and the medium of retro style gameplay, but it's also the physical experience of having a cartridge. So we're going to talk about innovation on the content side, but we're also going to talk a lot about the innovation on the physical side. So pictured here, we have two of our cartridges that we work with. The Meeting is an upcoming game that's coming out later this year, maybe early 2021, depending on how current events shake out. But that's an actual NES cartridge. We have a special way of working with the plastic that gives it that meat look. So it's very much a different kind of special edition experience that we get over top of the classic gray cartridge. And the cartridge in the bottom left is like an acrylic, so it's textured, may feel like brick. Still plays in original hardware, but elevating what it means to have that physical experience as part of your games, which we're seeing becoming a lot more important. And we're going to dig into that as well. So now that you know what we're talking about, let's kind of do a high-level overview of everything we're going to cover. And I'm going to have to move kind of quickly, so feel free to message me or email me afterwards. Happy to answer any questions you have. Also, more than happy to geek out with you about this for as long as you want. So we're going to talk about what the modern business case looks like for retro, and what original retro development looks like in the landscape of gaming with everything that's going on in gaming. How does retro game development sit alongside an industry where VR development's also a thing? As much as those feel like very different spectrums, they have a lot in common in terms of player engagement and player experience. So we're going to dig through that. We're going to talk about the players that are doing a lot with aftermarket hardware, and I'll define that. So these are like new consoles that play old games. We'll talk about re-releases, the market for repackaging old games and producing them in a new way and redistributing them to the audiences that purchase these kind of products. We'll talk about retro development. We'll talk about books about retro. We'll talk about the fan community and how the fan community is driving major trends on streaming platforms and content creation platforms, and how even fans who might not be doing it professionally are actually making major waves in the industry and changing the way people approach streamable content and the way they approach game content in general. And we'll dig way deep into that stream innovation. And we'll also talk about what the audience for this kind of industry looks like and how it dovetails with the rest of the gaming industry. So like I said, at the top of the presentation, you're welcome to ask questions as we go. And I'm happy to make this more of a conversation if you like. So aftermarket hardware, the way we're using that term is hardware that interfaces with the original hardware, but is made from a third-party developer. So a couple different examples we have laid out here. The NES and SNES Classic are not technically third-party developers, but they're very different from the original consoles. And I wanted to kind of pull that out as an indicator of like high level, what kind of engagement retro content's getting. No one expected these products to do poorly, I don't think, but I think the performance that they did see surprised even Nintendo, because there were product shortages. They had to do re-releases and kind of retool their manufacturing pipeline to keep up with demand. So these products did pretty well. And at this point, these numbers are probably a couple months old. So even more of these have probably sold since then. What gets really exciting for me as a retro enthusiast, though, and as someone that works in this space, is the amount of activity that's occurring outside of a major player like Nintendo. So NX, Hyperkin, and Analog all produce modern versions of these retro consoles. And there's a couple different bells and whistles that make them exciting. But really the biggest thing is that they have modern outputs. So it's easier to connect them to an HD television and play your old games. That can be a bit of a barrier for entry when you start getting into hardware that's 20-some years old, 30-some years old in some cases. So that those modern considerations are a big deal as far as accessibility goes. For someone like me, having a CRT television in your game room is kind of like a mark of character, but I also recognize it's weird to have a 300-pound television in your home. Not everyone wants or can do that. So having the modern outputs is a big deal. And 8BitDo focuses primarily on controllers, and they've done a lot of cool controllers also for modern consoles. So assessing the size of this market is a little tricky. So we've looked at all the indicators that we see in terms of working with independent game stores, what we see at conventions, what we see on how we're fulfilling cartridges and things like that. And we estimate in a very unscientific, back of the envelope kind of way that about 75,000 aftermarket consoles are sold each year. And you see that these companies have been in business for a while. So that's a pretty large influx of aftermarket consoles on top of the existing consoles that are still floating around for these kinds of games, kinds of hardware experiences. And I should throw out that we got to work on the firmware for the Super NT from Analog, so that was super cool. So aftermarket hardware is a big deal, and it's thriving, and these companies are doing pretty well. Now here's where it gets interesting. So there's been a major resurgence and a major trend towards re-releasing popular classic games with special edition packaging, new cartridges. So it gives you that full, complete in-box experience. So you remember, for me, it was going to Toys R Us, and you'd like pull the little tab off the wall, You take it up to the front, pay for it, and they go in the back in the secret room and like they produce your sealed box with the cartridge inside, the manual, all the extra inserts. It was kind of a ritual in itself, and that physical experience made buying that game extra special. And you see that now also playing out with physical Switch purchases, physical PlayStation purchases. There's several vendors working in that space and doing very well, doing physical releases of certain types of games because fans want that collector feel. They want to have it on their shelf. They want to have something tangible that represents what they're passionate about. So you can see here by the numbers that are listed out, and this is all data that's publicly available from these websites. These cartridges do pretty well, a lot better than I think you might assume a retro cartridge would perform if you're looking at it from the outside in, not really thinking about the gaming space. Now, these are smaller quantities than a major game release might have, but where this gets even more interesting for someone like me that works in marketing is a Star Wars re-release timed well with a new Star Wars film or a new Star Wars series or even just a new Star Wars product or activation. The games themselves are kind of tying into a groundswell of interest for other things. And they're not always strictly a isolated product play by themselves. A lot of times they're part of a larger ecosystem, which we'll talk about more later on and why that's super important. I do want to call out UltraCore though. So the UltraCore release is really interesting because UltraCore was a game that was developed in the original retro era, but never got released. So because there is this new interest in retro games, because there's new interest in retro content, a project that never saw the light of day got to experience a physical release when in another reality it probably wouldn't have. It would stay just lost in the archives. So that's pretty neat to see. So there's a market for this. There's whole companies built on doing just the re-release of old content. These are cartridges that used to be available and they're still selling pretty well. So let's check out how that extends into the digital world. So you can re-release a game on physical mediums, but there's also a big trend towards re-releasing retro games on modern platforms. Now, this seems like a no-brainer when you see it happen, but there's some interesting technical challenges that go into this in terms of optimizing and translating and porting a retro game to make it massively available. So technical hurdles aside, the market for this is also pretty compelling. So this means that fans of the original series are rebuying this content again because they want to play it on their Switch or they want to play it on an Xbox or a PlayStation, depending on the game and depending on the genre, right? They're rebuying the game, and that's likely triggering new fans to experience this game in the first place. So fans that may have never played Final Fantasy VI before are picking it up and playing it for the first time. And that triggers this like retro rabbit hole where they might go back and buy the Super Nintendo cartridge because they become such big fans of it. Now, from a game development perspective, this gets even more exciting because along the way, you start to get this reimagining of what this retro experience was. So Link's Awakening, the remake that did, I think, again, surprisingly well. I think it turned a lot of heads for how well that release did. Still had those retro roots, still very much was in line with the experience of the original, but a couple modern tweaks gave that content new life. And that's pretty exciting from an artistic perspective. And it's also really exciting from a business perspective because there might be a lot more value in old games than a lot of people give them credit for. So this is where a company like MegaCat will come in. We talk about brand new retro titles. So the communities behind these kinds of games have been in existence for years and years and years. They're run by incredibly passionate people that have been hacking away, making NES games, Genesis games. They've been doing this for years, a lot of times in really tight-knit online communities. And that's really important for a couple different reasons that we're going to dig into. But I want to make sure that those fans get a big shout out here. I mean, those creators get a big shout out here because that homebrew scene, the people that have been making these games as a hobby, are probably the biggest players in retro still being a major impact in modern game development because they've kept the medium alive, they've kept communities going, and they kept growing the value of what retro content can be. So again, to play this out into what the modern business case is. Micro Mages, and I converted this from pounds, did about $200,000 across 4,000 backers on Kickstarter, and that's just the Kickstarter sales. That doesn't take into account data that I don't have access to in terms of what they've sold since then, because Micro Mages also got a Steam release. So there's several different ways they've monetized that piece of content. Micro Mages is perhaps best known for doing, I believe it was 40 kilobits as their file size. The average homebrew ROM is like 400 kilobytes. So that's a pretty interesting technical feat there, and it got a lot of clout in the community for doing that. You'll see that these other projects have done also fairly well. Again, these are Kickstarter numbers alone. These don't take into account long tail sales and the impact they might have had on digital platforms for digital releases as well. So these are full-fledged content experiences. Play on original hardware, get the physical release with it. Now, as we look at what this experience has meant for physical cartridges and how that business has expanded, there's a lot of extensions of this community that have sprung out of physical cartridges and sprung out of this love for retro games. And I wish I had time to like fully unpack what that full spread means, but I want to give you a couple examples of how retro games and a passion for retro games are driving a broader interest in other kinds of products and other kinds of creative mediums. So for MegaCat, we see that the indie game store scene is thriving. There's a ton of indie retro game stores out there. Hopefully the virus doesn't destroy too many of them, because they're definitely small businesses in every sense of the word, and it could be a challenging circumstances. But as of this talk, we were distributing to about 300 retro game stores around the world. So those are businesses that are built on the back of retro content and retro gameplay. And in less traditional ways, we're seeing retro games impact industries like publishing. So when you look at what being a retro fan means and what retro content, what it means to experience retro content, we've really started to see this depth of player fandom that is echoing kind of throughout the rest of the games industry. So someone that's a fan of playing a game and loves that game and loves that medium is also the kind of person that might pick up a book about that game and read about that game and learn more about the backstory and the developers and the designers and what went into creating the game that they love so much. And that book, also being a physical artifact, turns into another part of the collector experience. So I hope you're starting to see a couple of the themes that are weaving in and out of this retro industry and how this retro industry works. And the impact of these books is also surprisingly large. Console Wars came out a couple years ago, and if you zoom in on my presentation here, you'll see that Seth Rogen and Evan Goldberg wrote the foreword. Yes, that's Seth Rogen. At one time, there were talks of Seth Rogen producing a movie about Console Wars. So that may or may not happen. Again, just a rumor, but it would be pretty cool to see a cinematic breakdown of Sega versus Nintendo, and then PlayStation slips in the back as kind of PlayStation, as PlayStation got the Nintendo snub in all of that. And that's a pretty meaty book. It's like 400 some pages, all on how Sega and Nintendo battled back and forth for supremacy around the world during the 90s. A couple other more granular topics that you might not think would be a part of the fan experience. Localization, you guys just saw a great presentation about that. So if you're watching this on YouTube, make sure you check out the translation localization talk that you missed, because it's fantastic. Localization is the idea of taking a piece of content from one region and reimagining it in another. So beyond just translating the literal meaning, also taking into account cultural nuances, and then also taking into account in the case of hardware differences. So things like voltage differences, or maybe the way cartridges read memory, things like that. There are differences on those fronts that have to be taken into account. And Clyde Mandelin, I apologize if I'm mispronouncing that last name. I've never gotten to meet him in person, but done several books on this front comparing the differences in localization between different cartridges. That sounds super nerdy. It is super nerdy, but it's also speaking to that broader fan experience. So you'll see NES compendiums, SNES compendiums, kind of breaking down all the titles. Some other interesting things that are coming out of this from a cultural perspective that I think are going to turn into a bigger gaming impact as we look at gaming communities and what gaming communities can do. Braving Britannia is a book all about the Ultima Online player histories, so fan-created events, fan-created stories in the MMO that kind of happened organically. And this capturing of the community and its power is another illustration of what games can do, not only from a community building perspective, but also a business perspective, because these are people who invested a lot of time into games. So books are becoming a massive amount of this, a massive part of the retro renaissance. And I really want to make sure that the takeaway you have here with this particular slide is that the physical experience matters. The depth of the fan experience is huge, to the point that people are buying things about games because they love the game that much. And the depth to which they're taking this content is in itself opening new doors for other kinds of experiences. Because if you're a game designer, you should probably pick up a book like Braving Britannia to understand what fan communities can do, what player communities can do, and how they interact and how they organize. If you're someone that's involved on the more deeper business side of gaming, that's maybe working on the marketing or the branding or making financial decisions, Console Wars might be super important for you to have. And these are histories and knowledge that are made possible because of the retro renaissance. If there was an interest in retro games, these books probably would not have happened. So ROM hacks. Another form of content creation that we're seeing in the retro community, and we have seen for years and years. Let me back up and define our terms, because I've referenced this a couple times. So ROM hacks are fan mods of original games. So in the PC world, they just use the word mods. In the console world, they use ROM hacks, because ROM is the name of the file that goes onto a cartridge. So the reason these are important is because a lot of what we've seen in the games industry as a whole is also true in the retro community. So let me give you an example. So Counter-Strike started as a fan-created mod for Half-Life, right? And it's probably the most legendary story of a mod becoming a full-fledged game. But really now in modern gaming, there's several dozen use cases of that, where fans took their passion and fan-created content turned into a trend within the gaming space. And that trend then drove business decisions beyond what the fans had created. Now, that's important, because as we look at our work as professionals, I imagine many people that are watching this are interested in game design, game development, the business of gaming, just by the nature of the event. We need to be looking at the choices fans are making, and we need to be looking at the way fan communities are interacting with content to get a true sense of the direction gaming is going. Yes, we can have a lot of innovation. We can potentially have innovation separately from fans. I'd argue it's hard to do that. But a lot of the innovation in gaming comes from the players themselves. And if you nurture these communities and spend the time with these communities, you can see some pretty interesting indicators. So to give you a sense of how passionate these communities are, Return of the Dark Sorcerer is a Final Fantasy VI ROM hack. Massive amount of content, new characters, new spells, new levels. Like, it's almost a different game that has a Final Fantasy VI sheen on it at this point. It's been in development for 10 years, and there's something like 40 people on the credits that have contributed everything from art to music to programming to this ROM hack. That's a pretty significant fan undertaking. People spending 10 years on anything is incredible, let alone a fan project where they don't get paid. And it's made a lot of headlines for the depth of the content that is created and the commitment of the developers that go with it. Now, where that turns into a business use case, let's talk about Kaizo levels. So Mario fans are familiar with Kaizo blocks. A Kaizo is a form of Mario ROM hack that is extremely difficult. So if you've seen the levels of Mario where the very first World 1, Level 1 is rebuilt with a bunch of spinning fireballs, the fireball traps looping around, it seems like it'd be impossible to navigate. That's an example of a Kaizo level. And if you pop up any streaming service and you look at these professional level Mario players, you'll see them wrecking levels like this all day, every day, these incredibly difficult level creations. And they're probably doing it now in Mario Maker, which is an official product from Nintendo. But really, the Mario ROM hacking community, the Kaizo community, has been doing it for years. And the conspiracy theorist in me says that Nintendo likely looked at the traction in the Kaizo community, likely looked at the traction that the Kaizo community was seeing on YouTube and on live streaming. Because if you look at not just what people were playing, but how people react to it, you get a pretty big indicator of what a product in that space would look like. So in this sense, these ROM hackers pioneered what's become a medium of games in itself, these like level creation, level sharing style games that are now super popular and not only have a ton of fans in their own right, but also attract a ton of viewers on the live streaming side. And that's a pretty powerful way to start thinking about what game content could be, and retro has really driven a lot of that and driven a lot of that impact. So you see here that there's a ton of viewing metrics here that we can look at. Mario Maker has sold 4 million units. Mario Maker 2 has sold 4 million units. There's also a subscription service that comes with that. If you want to download levels, you have to pay like $3 a month to the Nintendo eShop as a subscription. So it's also a subscription play. It's a software as a service model buried into a Mario game, which is mind blowing. You think about where Mario was 20 years ago, but ROM hackers were pushing it that direction also. The other side of this that we can dig into, I want to make sure I'm mindful of my time. I don't want to take too much away from our other slides here. But the maker community supporting ROM hacks is also growing. So NES Maker is a tool that lets you make new NES games, load them onto a cartridge, they play on original hardware, simplifies a lot of the technical side of retro development. So you don't need to learn assembly, you don't need to learn C. It's still helpful if you have some of that knowledge, but it makes that NES development a lot more accessible than it was in the past. Now, since I submitted this presentation and since I created this PowerPoint, 2 different creators have announced Super Nintendo versions of this concept. So NES Maker, which is the kind of the flagship product in this community, announced that they're doing a Super Nintendo version of their product. And then another competitor has announced that they're also doing a Super Nintendo Maker. So these are tools that, again, make it easier for people to make Super Nintendo games in more of a drag and drop fashion, not quite as limited by technical hurdles. By the way, it's hard to find assembly programmers. So if you're watching this and if you work in assembly, if you work in C, shoot me an email because we would love to have you on our team. So we've talked a lot about streaming, and we've talked a lot about streaming's impact on, at least tangentially, we've talked about how streaming has been kind of a marker of what retro has done for the gaming industry and how it starts to lead the gaming industry in other directions. So couple big pillars here for us to break out and really talk about what retro has done. Speedrunning is the easiest one to point to. So speedrunning, I would argue in a lot of ways, was one of the first proof of concepts that live streaming games was going to be a viable thing, because speedrunning was one of the major reasons people would pick up and replay content and also pick up and re-record content. So there weren't a lot of reasons to record a regular gameplay mode, but if you start getting into players that are really good at running a level and really good at playing a certain kind of game, now it becomes more entertaining to watch that player, and you start to kind of start this groundswell of live streaming video game content on top of the social aspects. So speedrunning has continued driving this interest in retro games, and I would argue ultimately led to something like Mario Maker, because of speedrunners, because people wanted more Mario challenges, we saw more Mario content, eventually got to a product like Mario Maker. Now, that's dovetailed into charity events. So if you're watching this, you're probably familiar with something like Games Done Quick. So Games Done Quick has raised several millions of dollars for various charities on the back of retro engagement, on the back of the passion that players have for these games, and then that passion gets redirected into a charity stream. ROM hacks on streams are also a big deal because, again, it's a fresh piece of content that's still tied to an old concept that ends up being pretty interesting for viewers. And randomizers have also been a huge shift in the retro industry. So a randomizer is a form of ROM hack that takes an original game and then randomizes some elements so that every time you play it, it's a little bit different. I think like a roguelike kind of approach to it. And the most popular example is probably Link to the Past, the classic Zelda title on Super Nintendo. The randomizers for Zelda at their most basic level, there's a lot of variations now. At their most basic level, reorder where all the items appear in chests. So the typical item gating game design philosophy turns into a roguelike experience where every time you boot up a different randomized seed, those items are in different places. You have to explore the world and solve challenges in different ways. That's turned into races. That's turned into major events. And that's also turned into a lot of fresh content around these communities. So the numbers we crunched on this, again, back of the envelope math here, dramatic pause. Based on the data that's publicly available from live streaming services, we estimate that the Link to the Past randomizer outperformed the average growth of live streaming, the average interest growth in live streaming by about 30%. So because these randomizers were in place, because they were giving players more reasons to come back to retro content, Link to the Past saw 30% more streamed hours per year than it would have if it just followed general streaming trends. I hope that makes sense, because it's a pretty significant impact for a piece of content to have. Now, the takeaway there is this like rogue-like idea that we've seen in a lot of games has turned into making these games more streamable, right? So games like Binding of Isaac, games like Dead Cells, these randomization elements lead to these interesting player wow moments. They lead to these interesting organic challenges for the player to experience, but also for the viewers to experience with the player. And the retro community has also tapped into that. And that's pretty interesting to see. And I think the retro community has largely demonstrated what that can mean for the life cycle of a game too. So if Link to the Past is still interesting, Link to the Past came out in 1991, and is still seeing millions of hours streamed. It says a lot about what a creative approach to content can mean for the total life cycle of a game. So in that spirit, the modern retro scene has seen quite a bit of traction as well. And this slide's not going to be a surprise to anybody. These are four of the most legendary pixel art games out there at this point. But kind of framing them in the context of how they leveraged the love for retro and the passion for retro that's still very much alive, I think is important, especially from a game design perspective and also from a marketing perspective. Because at this point, nostalgia is a very real emotional button to push when you're marketing a product. So we see car dealerships do it. We see sports organizations do it. And we're definitely seeing it in video games. And understanding kind of the ecosystem around retro can make us as professionals a bit more informed when we're thinking about playing upon nostalgia, when we're thinking about building on something that's retro. So something like Shovel Knight, they, in very key places, stuck with that classic 8-bit inspired gameplay. Stardew Valley built on the back of the success of Harvest Moon and kind of leveraged in what modern hardware would make possible, but still having that Harvest Moon aesthetic was a big deal. Then, of course, games like Dead Cells and Celeste, this hardcore platforming feel plus some pixel art. It's familiar enough that players feel like they're picking up a retro experience, but it's also new enough and nuanced enough that it feels fresh when they do pick it up. And that's pretty cool to see, and it's going to open some interesting doors in the future from a development perspective, because retro development, as these NES Maker tools and Super Nintendo Maker tools become available, it's going to be a little bit easier to make retro products because those are available. And we're seeing that the interest in physical products is growing, so we're likely to see modern retro tie back into original retro. So I think in the future, it would not be out of bounds to guess that a game that has pixel art in it might also have a retro tie-in at some point. So let's talk at a pretty high level here of what these takeaways might look like. And I see someone in the chat. There's Embedded Engineer. You should definitely shoot me a message. And Landon, thank you for the compliment on the slides. I'm very fortunate to work with some great artists and designers that I can just steal all of their pixel art for any presentation that I put together. So, what are the big takeaways here? I realize that we covered a ton of ground. We have an ebook about this coming out soon. We have a ton of resources on our website, both around the business of retro and also around retro development. So if you want to learn more about the back end of this, how this works, if you want to make your own retro games, check us out. If you want to learn more about the business case, you can also check us out there. So, from our position in the games industry and in retro, we're seeing some very distinct trends and some pretty powerful trends around what the future of the games industry might be in the context of retro integrations and retro tie-ins. So one of the things that we're starting to get a lot of inklings of is modern IPs are going to start incorporating retro games, physical cartridge releases into their IP universes in a similar way that they do with DLC. So if you think about a game that has a major fan following, DLC is one way to monetize it. Soundtracks are one way to monetize it. There's also things like skins and special weapons and things like that. It's another way to monetize that IP. Then you kind of go into all the full gamut of your traditional physical products, all your merch, your t-shirts, your hats, your pins. Those are all going to be here to stay, and I think those are doing very well. But I think the tie-in between new content and physical experience of a retro cartridge is going to start playing a bigger factor as well. So at MegaCat, we've already started experimenting with this, and we've seen some pretty good traction on it. So Bite the Bullet is a game we have coming out later this summer, and Bite the Bullet is going to launch with or it's going to have a Sega Genesis prequel tie-in. So the main game, modern platforms, PC, Xbox, Switch, the full modern release. But then if you want to experience the prequel, some of the backstory, learn more about the characters in the game, you can pick up the Sega Genesis cartridge. Oh yeah, it's also a cool collectible. It's cool on the shelf. It looks good as a physical product. So you kind of get this multi-layered tie-in that still builds this larger universe. You're going to see a lot more of that, and you're going to see pretty creative uses of that as more retro tools and retro hardware becomes available that open the door to some new opportunities there. We talked a lot about major IPs remonetizing their retro libraries, and from what we're seeing, we're at the very beginning of that. Just re-releasing a game on a cartridge and just re-releasing a game as a digital product is kind of the ground floor of what it means to reimagine or work with a retro IP that you might own. So if you think about like the giants out there in the gaming industry that have these huge back catalogs of games, have been in business for 30 years or acquired several companies that have a similar history, you could potentially take a retro game, and because you have these ROM hacking experts and things like that available, you can add new content to old games. You can remaster them for modern platforms, interesting ways, and still have authentic art. You can add interesting features like online play and things like that to games that did not have them before if you have the right creators available to you. So there's not just this recycling potential there, where it is cool to re-release Mega Man on a fresh cartridge with a new box and special edition it. Like, there's a part of me that really really enjoys that. But there's the other part of me that would love to have the original level designer for a game like Mega Man X come back and add 3 new levels and those be on a cartridge for me to experience. This kind of stuff is possible now. The content pipelines are there, the manufacturing pipelines are there, and the demand for the retro content is there. So you're going to see some interesting creative takes on old IPs coming out that still use the retro as the baseline. It's going to get pretty wild once people start betting on those kinds of plays, because I would guess they're probably going to tie it into larger modern gameplay marketing as well. So interesting things to come. You heard it here first, hopefully. You'll see some cool stuff coming down the pipe. Streaming integrations have become a really, really big factor of modern game development. So for us at MegaCat, we look at the live streaming ecosystems available to us. Those fan communities are so engaged and there's so much traction there that we now treat live streaming as like a day one design decision. So as we're making a new game, work on a new game concept, we're constantly asking ourselves, what does this experience look like if we stream it? what does that mean for the player streaming it? What does it mean for the audience engaging with it? And trying to find new ways to build that crossover and trying to find new ways to make a game more interesting for not only replayability, but also audience participation and things like that. So Mixer has done a lot on the innovation side there of people in chat can trigger what happens in a stream, and you'll see other streaming platforms are also doing things like that too. And there's a big battle to be played there, and there's a big design consideration for any developer working now to think about how their game fits into a world where a lot of gamers experience their preview of a game from a live stream, or a lot of gamers make their purchasing decisions based on what they see live streamers playing. And that's going to be a big part of retro also, because there's a lot of potential for these kinds of games to also be integrated, new and old, into these streaming services. Last two things here I'll run through as quickly as I can, so we have some time for questions. I think you're going to see new types of retro hardware become available as well. Analog has a couple interesting features that haven't really been leveraged yet because the developer interest hasn't been there. I think as this space continues to grow, you'll probably see some interesting hardware-specific content that's available. As we see NES Maker and SNES Maker, or whatever iteration of that kind of concept ends up becoming the king, as we see those, I think you'll also see more innovations on the hardware side that try to marry the best of what made retro amazing and also what makes modern gaming pretty amazing, because modern gaming is incredible. You'll see some innovation on the hardware side. Starting to get there. Hyperkin working on a light gun is super slick. I think there's going to be, and having like an EverDrive is also pretty awesome. But I think you're going to start to see even more considerations into what are new ways we can use this old hardware experience? What are new ways we can tie it into? What are other experiences we can have and still kind of have that retro ethos and keep it very much alive? And then we've talked a lot about the tools for creating retro content. I think you're going to see even more of that. So currently, we have a ton of Unity tutorials as well. I mentioned the guides and stuff we have on our website. You'll see that the support for creating the barriers are going to continue to come down. The ROM hacking communities have done an amazing job of making a lot of that knowledge available on the ROM hacking level, and it's just grown and grown and grown over the years. I think we're going to see a lot more of that to make the fan created sides of this experience even more accessible. So let's jump into some questions here in the last 10 minutes or so that we have. Bloodstained is a good example. Yep. So that was a chat comment. Bloodstained is a fantastic example of what a modern retro experience can mean for gameplay, and also how much traction it can get. I'm actually in the middle of a playthrough of Bloodstained right now, and I'm absolutely loving it. It feels enough like a retro game that I scratch that retro itch, but there's also a lot of freshness to the game mechanics that make it more engaging and more interesting to play. So I don't feel like I'm playing a Castlevania remake. I feel like I'm playing a fresh experience in that spirit. Another question that we got here, do you often include things like in-game timestamps or playtime to encourage/support speedrunners? So on our side, the way we try to support speedrunning with our games, not with in-game timers or timestamps, mostly because that particular community is pretty tech savvy and they're good with tools like LiveSplit is pretty much a staple for speedrunners. But what we do think about is the way we make player choice a part of our games. So for example, Bite the Bullet, we're fortunate to be partnered with Speed Gaming. They're a pretty popular speedrunning tournament network, and they host like Super Metroid leagues, Link to the Past leagues, Final Fantasy leagues, and these are all people competing against each other in races. And we use Speed Gaming as a way to showcase our game and also get some pretty dynamic, sometimes embarrassing. It really sucks when your game breaks on a live stream, even if it's in beta. It's still pretty embarrassing. But kind of putting that game in front of speedrunners lets us experience a different kind of beta feedback than we would if we were using traditional Q&A. Because speedrunners have a certain kind of mentality of how they approach gameplay. And a speedrunner will also test the quality of your tutorial pretty hard, because the speedrunner is going to skip pretty much everything. So if you don't get good at teaching by showing, speedrunners are gonna make that clear to you pretty quickly. So for us, as a company, our encouragement of speedrunners comes largely from us trying to be involved in the communities, and put up prize money and things like that. So recently, there's a Super Metroid League that's in process. We got to partner with Balls Garana and put up a prize package, so the people that take first, second, and third get actual cash for playing Super Metroid, which is pretty wild for it to be 2020 and someone's making money from playing Super Metroid. That's totally bonkers to me, but it's the exact kind of world that I want to live in. Um, do you think that people would like a game engine for modern platforms as architecture similar to retro consoles like the SNES, Genesis, with backgrounds, layers, sprites, parallax, etc.? That's a great question. Great question, Kirby. I mentioned our Unity tutorials earlier. So a lot of these kinds of development environments that more match retro, a lot of these settings are available in game development tools now. So we have a guide on how you set up a Unity project to match Sega Genesis specs or to match Super Nintendo specs. That's a big part of our personal development process. So if we're making a retro game, it's very, very, very difficult to iterate in assembly or to iterate in C. So we do a lot of our prototyping in a platform like Unity because it's easier to make changes and make adjustments. And if we set the constraints up appropriately, we can still make sure that we're aiming at the right hardware spec at the end of the day. So we're not using the wrong kinds of art, we're not using too much RAM, that sort of stuff. So there's a lot of guides that lets you kind of follow those constraints. And if you're not actually interested in putting on a retro console, you can still kind of capture the flavor and feel that way. And Kirby followed up to say that, yeah, Unity's obviously way more powerful, thousands of sprites. Yeah, so we specifically set the constraints so that we're working within the certain sprite count. We're working within the right background specs and things like that so that we're not developing a game that's not possible on the hardware. Those guides, to answer another question coming in, those guides are available at megacatstudios.com. So check out our blog there. So other questions that we've got in here, a lot more depth on the retro development. Can you comment on how the retro scene market can help with video game history and preservation efforts? So there's a lot of great organizations working on this front as well. We personally, as a company, were fortunate enough to participate in some of the Smithsonian's efforts and their history of gaming. We actually did an NES cartridge as part of like a fundraising effort for them called Justice Duel. You play as robot presidents riding eagles. So think like Joust, except you're Abraham Lincoln or Teddy Roosevelt cyborg version. Makes total sense in the context of the Smithsonian. But there's a lot of people working on that front to preserve this hardware and preserve this part of history. And I think the retro resurgence makes that easier because I think the interest in these kinds of products and these kinds of gameplay experience makes it less likely for someone to throw away a cartridge that they find. They're more likely to look into the history. They're more likely to see if it has value instead of just chucking it. There's plenty of horror stories in the retro community of people that grew up with games that like lost their entire childhood collection. I'm one of those people and having to like rebuild it. But at this point, since they're popular enough and there's enough general pop culture interest around it, people are saving more of those things. And that's exciting because the games industry moves so quickly that it's easy for a lot of really fantastic creative, a lot of really fantastic gameplay and projects kind of just disappear into the ether of the past. That's pretty sad, but because of a community like retro fans, that content not only gets a second chance, but it's also more likely to be preserved because there's people out there that still want to experience it. And the Ultra Core project is a great example of that, the re-release. So I think that about does it for my time. So I think we can wrap up here and see if any other questions. You briefly mentioned fan gaming is part of how the retro scene is resurging. Do you have any examples? Can you tell me a bit more about what you mean by fan gaming? Talking about like a Link to the Past ROM hack driving interest in more Link to the Past gameplay. That might be an example of what you mean there, if I understand.
Wait for that, just for the lag to kick in. I have another question, if you don't mind.
Hit me.
Do you think there's enough of a market in the new retro game scene to make a living specifically as a retro developer?
So, yes, we're one of the studios that is has done that. We do a lot of different things now, but really we built, I say we, I came to MegaCat a year and a half or so ago. So I mean, the great people that came before me at MegaCat, that's built on the back of retro development, built on selling retro cartridges, and there's a lot of ingenuity there. Our founder James approached retro in a little bit of a different way on the business side to make it more viable, but there's definitely it's definitely possible for it to be a full-time job. It's kind of a whole other discussion of how to turn retro development into like your full-time business, because it's not easy. I'm not saying it's easy at all, but it is possible. And if you have the right mindset, you're a little creative about how you actually run the business, it's doable. It's doable.
So that'll be the next talk I look forward to listening in from you.
Hit me up. Happy to do it.
And Ia in the chat, if I pronounce that right, clarified their question. So there's
Oh yeah. So there's a lot of fan games. There's a lot of new games based on like original fan content, and that starts to get into some murky territories. I feel like mods are in that fair use, not being a lawyer, in that fair use bucket roughly, but you start to get into full on IP remakes, starts to get a little hairy legally. But there's a ton of those games out there that have been fully rebuilt, fully reimagined. Return of the Dark Sorcerer is a good example to fall back to on the presentation there. But yeah, so I appreciate you having me. This is a fantastic event. I'm excited to see the talks that are coming up.
Well, thank you. This was a very interesting talk, and it's always interesting to see. I can't even call it really niche anymore because it's really blown up into its own pretty much other division of the industry. So it's fantastic to get more insight into that. If anybody wants to continue the conversation with you, Marshall, where's some good places to find you?
So megacatstudios.com is dropped there in the chat. That's the best place to kind of find our HQ. Feel free to reach out to me on Twitter or on LinkedIn, and I'd be happy to connect with you there.
All right. Well, thank you for your time and for presenting this talk today, Marshall. I hope you have a good afternoon.
It was a blast. Thanks for having me.
All right. Take care.